Hey everybody, thanks so much for tuning in today. I'm Joe Young here at IIHS, and I have Matt Brumbelow, our Principal Research Engineer here at the Institute, to talk through some really exciting new research looking at headlight glare. Before we jump in, if you like this kind of content, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow so you never miss this type of video, as well as some of our crash tests and other research coming out of the Institute. So Matt, thanks for spending some time with me today. Really excited to talk about your new study, which looked at headlight glare. Before we jump into that, can you just tell us a little bit about what you do here at the Institute?
Sure, yeah. So I'm a research engineer, which means that I take data that we're collecting in our crash tests and try to correlate that to what's happening in the field, so in real-world crashes. And a lot of my research has looked at different crash modes and how the things we're measuring on our dummies or on the vehicle predict or don't predict what's happening when we look at field crash data. But a part of that, about 10 years ago, we started looking into nighttime crashes and trying to understand how headlight performance and design might affect outcomes in those field crashes.
Yeah, so I know we've been focused on headlights a lot over the last decade. We launched our headlight ratings program in 2016, which we're going to talk about a little bit during this discussion. But your most recent look was specifically at headlight glare. From a social media standpoint, we get questions about headlight glare a lot, especially recently. It seems like it's something that's bothering people out there on the road. And so that kind of prompted you to look into whether it's actually causing more crashes. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And it is a big part of our ratings. As you said, we've been rating headlights since 2016, and there's two pieces to that. Because there's two pieces to how you design a good headlight. You need to get enough light on the road for the driver of the vehicle, but not at the expense of glaring everybody else. And so both of those go into our rating, and we had previously been able to study the first part, the visibility part, and show that better ratings in our tests meant fewer crashes for the drivers of those vehicles. What's harder to study, and what I tried to do in this study, was look at the other end. Is that coming at the expense of more crashes for other road users?
So talk to me really quickly about challenges with studying glare out there looking at real-world crashes.
Right, so it might be easy to talk about the contrast. If we're looking at visibility, we know the vehicle that's involved in the crash and what we measured on our track for the headlight performance of that vehicle, so it's really easy to correlate that. If you're, though, out on the road and you experience glare from another vehicle, if that vehicle doesn't hit you or you don't hit it, you're never going to know what caused the glare. And so that's the challenge here, was if a crash occurs because of glare, we never really know what vehicle or multiple vehicles caused it, if the high beams were on or the low beams. And so that kind of made it so we had to use a different approach for this study.
So tell me about that approach. So you looked at crash reports, is that right? As opposed to looking at just the raw data and associating with the vehicle model and so forth.
That's right. So every state has its own data collection process for crashes, which sometimes is a headache for researchers, but in other instances like this, it actually provides more information because we can go into those states and see which ones are recording these different contributing factors. And so I identified 11 different states that have on somewhere in the police crash report form the opportunity for the officers to say that, yes, glare contributed to this crash. And sometimes that's glare from the sun, sometimes that's glare from headlights, so I had to further narrow it down to crashes that happened when it was dark outside. And then I could look at the rate of that happening over time. So it's not, I kind of have referred to this as squishy data, because someone had to report that they were affected by glare for it to get into the crash report. But by looking at 11 different states over 8 or 9 different years, we could see the very consistent kind of trends that were there that gave us some confidence that this was real.
All right, so how many crash reports are we talking about in total of these 11 states, and what was the time frame you looked at for this?
Yeah, so the study was really focused on when we launched our headlight rating program, which was 2016, up until the latest data I could get. So there's 1 or 2 states we had 2024 data, but most of that was cut off at 2023 to this point. And including the daytime and nighttime crashes, there were over 20 million crashes, and then specifically at night there were 6 million. So when we were looking at the headlight potential for headlight glare, we had 6 million data points to kind of evaluate how many of those were affected by glare.
All right, so what was kind of the big takeaway?
The big takeaway was that across the 11 states and across all of those years, there's very consistent rate of around 1 to 2 of every 1,000 nighttime crashes where the officer recorded on the form that, yes, glare contributed to this. And so the fact that it was consistent across the states within that pretty narrow range of 0.1 to 0.2%, and also from one year to the next was, building the confidence that this is probably pretty accurate, at least for the kind of crashes that a driver could report that this was a factor.
So I think we can all agree, your study looks like headlight glare is not necessarily changing over time in terms of crash rates anyway, but I think we can all agree that it still can be dangerous. Obviously, it's still distracting at times. Are there other studies out there that have looked at glare and its role in crashes, or anything that we can say about how drivers tend to respond to glare?
Yeah, most of the studies that have been done before on glare involve very controlled kind of laboratory conditions, or a driver in a test vehicle may be out on the road, but they're measuring how they respond to different glare inputs. And so we do know that there's glare that can be a distraction, and then at some point that transitions into disability glare. It's referred to where your visual performance actually is affected by the amount of glare that you're experiencing. And so that threshold is probably different for everybody. It changes as you age. There are a lot of other factors that go into it. And so it is a problem. That's why we measure it in our test. But in terms of the size of the problem relative to insufficient visibility, it's a much smaller piece of the risk of crashing at night.
All right, so you mentioned our tests, and I want to talk a little bit more about how we evaluate vehicles for headlights here at IIHS. But before we do, let's set the stage. Can you talk us a little bit about the regulatory framework around headlights in this country, and whether that's changed in recent years or decades?
Sure. So the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration writes the regulations for vehicle performance, and they have federal motor vehicle safety standards, or FMVSSs, that govern certain parts of vehicle performance. And so the one over headlights is FMVSS 108. It's hundreds of pages of very arcane language.
I'm not sure if I would recommend going and reading it because it's I've tried.
A slog.
Yeah.
It's a slog. And so there have been different tweaks over the years, but the biggest kind of piece of how visibility and glare are related hasn't fundamentally changed since at least the late 1990s. And even then, you could argue it wasn't a huge shift. And so the way that the headlights are certified to pass the regulation is very different from how we're testing them on the vehicle on our track. So it's literally just the lamp itself on a test fixture with sensors around to measure the light that's coming out at different angles, to make sure that the light that's coming out at an angle that should hit the road is bright enough, and where it's going to hit your eyes, or the eyes of somebody else, is not too bright. There's several problems, but a big one is then that headlight gets slapped on a vehicle in the production line, and it could be aimed differently. It could be at a different height or a different spread. So there's no real control on how the standard predicts the field's performance of a headlight. And so that's why essentially we started doing our test.
Right. So you went out there, you looked at the real world data and saw that obviously nighttime crashes are a problem. I think it's about half of all crash fatalities occur at night, despite the fact that most driving does occur in the day.
That's right. Yeah, it's hard to get miles per kind of exposure variable, but the estimates I've seen are maybe a quarter to a third of the driving is at night, so definitely overrepresented for fatal crashes.
Right, and so you and the team here at IIHS about a decade ago came together and said we need to develop a ratings program. So you were involved in the actual design of the headlight test program?
That's right.
Can
Yeah.
you talk to us just about what that looks like for our test drivers? What's involved with the actual test that we've been running now since 2016?
On our test track, we set up different approaches. So the test vehicle is being driven on the track, and there's sensors set up on the track to measure the visibility light. So those are pretty close to the ground. And then there's sensors set up to measure the glare light. So they're at the eye height of an oncoming driver. And then the test vehicle comes in either on a straightaway, and then we have 2 right curves and 2 left curves, and we're testing high beams and low beams, and so all of that data gets recorded and measured against kind of the criteria that we've set for what a good headlight should be. So it's a lot of work for our team here. They're here a lot of nights of the year testing very late. But it gets really this unique set of performance data for headlights that you can't get anywhere else.
And the glare readings we're looking at, of course, for low beams, but for high beams, we're not concerned about glare because typically you wouldn't be, using your high beams in that scenario.
Right. The glare limits are only for the low beams.
And then also you can get extra credit for something we call high beam assist, right? Can you tell us what that technology is?
Sure. A lot of new vehicles have this now, and a big part of that is because our test does have the incentive for that, but it uses usually it's a camera or a light sensor behind the rear view mirror, so it can detect oncoming vehicles and automatically adjust between the high beams and the low beams depending on if there are other vehicles around. And so we wanted to really encourage that because we had partnered with University of Michigan to do a study that found even in rural, isolated driving, no other vehicles around, less than 1 in 5 drivers were using their high beams. And so we know that that's going to affect crash risk, and we wanted to encourage that technology.
Matt, let's talk just quickly about headlight height because, we've got different vehicles out on the road, minivans, SUVs, small cars, and their headlights are at different heights. How does that affect their performance in terms of glare?
Right, so in the regulation, it has no effect. So because the regulation is only testing the headlight itself, it doesn't matter where it's going to be put on the vehicle, and it can pass the test and be put on a sports car really low to the ground or on a pickup really high from the ground. So that's another benefit of our test, is that we're testing all these vehicles the same. We chose the eye height for where our glare stands are based on a mid-sized car, and so everything has to do well with essentially a mid-sized car target as the oncoming vehicle.
Right, so that's basically the eyes of someone sitting in a mid-sized car. That's what we're looking at for glare.
Exactly. So we have seen design changes that I'm sure are at least partly inspired by our test, where headlights are now being put lower down on the vehicle, which makes a lot of sense because it gives a much bigger buffer between getting the light on the road versus causing glare to somebody else.
This might go without saying, but you need headlights at night, and you need good headlights at night. Why are brighter headlights, like the ones being prompted by our ratings program, so important for safety at night?
Yeah, so again, for our rating where we're measuring both visibility and glare, and a headlight has to do both, but in terms of you driving your own vehicle, the best situation would be as much light as possible, right? High beams all the time. And even stronger high beams on certain roads are going to allow you to see an obstacle, or whether that's a deer or a pedestrian or a vehicle that's disabled in your lane or whatever, in time to brake or steer and avoid the crash. And so there's a lot of research out there actually showing that people regularly overdrive their headlights, which means they're driving faster than the amount of light that they have would allow them to see something and stop in time. And so it's again a perception thing. If I'm driving at night and I hit a deer, I may never think about, well, what if my headlights were brighter? Maybe I would have seen the deer in time. To me, it just ran out in front of me and I hit it. But what that means was, by the time I saw it, it was too late to do anything. Or the same with another obstacle that you might run into. So it's not something that, again, think of a police crash report. Probably nobody's out there saying, well, my headlights weren't bright enough, so I ran into the tree, because I went off the edge of the road, because they don't think, well, how this is a curvy road and I was driving too fast and my headlights aren't bright enough. Those things we don't think about them.
And I think that kind of speaks to the fact that people might not even realize there's such a variation in headlight performance if you go out and buy a vehicle.
That's right. I think the assumption could be, well, the regulation is harmonizing everything. And that was kind of my assumption until we started measuring these on our track and seeing a wide range of performance. What we're going for is to have, again, high beams on as much as possible when there are not other road users that you're going to glare, but then when you have to use your low beams, that you're still getting enough visibility to see and avoid a crash at a safe speed that you should be driving.
I don't know if you can answer this question easily, but with a vehicle that maybe gets a poor rating because of visibility in our tests, how fast can you safely drive? I mean, is it like you've only got this much stopping distance, or what is it?
There's a wide range of pours, and
Sure.
but we have done the math, and in certain cases and it depends on the obstacle, how reflective it is, how big it is to get you time to stop. But in some cases, you shouldn't be driving faster than like 35 miles an hour. And so on a dark, unlit road in the country, very few people are going to drive that slow. Right. But again, they won't know that this is really as far as I can see.
Mm-hmm. That's kind of scary to think about. Wow. All right. Well, yeah. And so, looking at ratings over time, of course, we've seen dramatic improvements since we launched the ratings program in 2016. We rate vehicles on what we call our GAMP scale, good, acceptable, marginal, poor, same as with our crash tests. So back to 2016, how were vehicles performing and what sort of improvements have we seen?
We've seen huge improvements, both in terms of the visibility and the glare components of those ratings. And when you put them together, our initial round of tests, we had one good performer out of, I think, somewhere between 70, 80 different headlight systems. 2017 model year, we had, built up, but I think it was still only about 10% were good. Whereas today, we have, if you count, I think it was the 2025 model year, we had about 50% of the vehicles were rated good. And so, again, that's coming from better visibility, but also when we first started, we were seeing lots of vehicles that had way too much glare, in some cases almost as much as you get from a high beam. And that number has fallen dramatically as well. Today, there's very few vehicles that have the excessive glare downgrade, which would take you all the way to marginal if you had good visibility otherwise.
So a vehicle cannot score an acceptable or higher with that excessive glare. That's the automatic marginal rating. And, I think it's worth just pointing out at this point, if viewers are interested in checking headlight ratings, a given model might have multiple headlight ratings. Can you speak to that?
Sure, yeah. And that was especially true when we first started. There was often, for any vehicle, kind of the base headlight option, which was often the cheapest, a halogen bulb with, call a reflector type headlamp. So it's kind of, as you picture, like the chrome facets behind the bulb that are reflecting the light forward. And then there was oftentimes a higher trim option that might have been HID or LED, and then often with a projector lens in front of it that helps spread the light out more. But because of our tests, a lot of those cheaper options have gone away, and it's not necessarily driven up costs because the LED efficiency and cost has come down. And so we see now today there are still vehicles where you'd have to check which trim am I getting. But with the newest vehicles, there's a lot more where you're just getting one headlight, and it's the best one they could design for that vehicle.
Yeah, and I'll say that our top safety pick award criteria, which have shifted over years, have surely encouraged that by requiring good or acceptable standard headlights so that people don't have to do a lot of shopping around to find those lights. So you mentioned LED and HID headlights. I think it's important that we talk about some headlight technologies, and as well as, getting your take on what we've seen automakers gravitating towards. So can you briefly just tell us kind of what we're looking at in terms of headlight technology in 2025?
Sure. Yeah. Most vehicles today, if they're at least a new design of a headlight, are coming with LED headlights as the light source. And that wasn't true when we started. Most vehicles were a halogen light source. So the halogen is a filament that has to get, you know, currents passing through it, but it's producing a lot of heat. So maybe more heat than light. It's not very efficient, but it was cheap, and it's what kind of most vehicles were equipped with. Again, over time, partly because of our tests, but partly just the improvements in the technology, LEDs have kind of taken over because they are a lot cheaper to make now, and they're much more efficient. They don't produce as much heat as a halogen. They last a lot longer, and so most new vehicles come with LEDs.
But our tests don't specifically call for any one technology. And I think halogens have performed well in our tests, but as you mentioned, we're seeing a lot of LEDs lately. So it's been now, I guess, 8, 9 years since we started evaluating headlights. And as you engineers like to do, you then went and looked at the real world data a couple years ago to figure out, hey, is this making a difference, right? What did you find when you looked at the real world data there?
Yeah, so that was the study where we were looking at visibility, just the visibility component of our rating, and I found that vehicles that had good rated visibility were involved in 19% fewer crashes, nighttime single vehicle crashes per mile, than those with poor visibility. So we knew at that point that getting more light on the track on our test is corresponding to better field outcomes, fewer crashes at night. Again, the missing piece, and we got a lot of questions in, was, well, what about glare? And so that's why I did this study, was to try and answer that question.
And I think, I'm going to predict some questions that are coming in right now from people that may be driving older vehicles with halogen lights that maybe aren't lighting the road. Hey, can I upgrade to aftermarket LED headlights? Is that an option to improve headlight performance? I know you've gotten that question before. What's your response?
Yeah, it depends what you mean by is it an option, because you can go on Amazon and buy LED replacement bulbs, but those are actually all illegal because they have, unless you're putting it in a vehicle that was designed for an LED bulb, there's many other pieces of the design of the headlight that go into the assumption that I'm going to have a halogen filament at this location to get the light in the right places. So replacing that with an LED that's much brighter and the light source is at a different location can improve performance. It can also make it worse, and it often makes glare much worse. And so people with the older halogen headlamps, you can replace the halogen bulbs and see a difference oftentimes because they can kind of build up. It looks almost like corrosion on the outside. And you can also get the lenses resurfaced. If they're hazy, that's something that people might want to look into as well.
Are there other things that are happening in the real world, like aftermarket LED headlights, that could be affecting the amount of glare that people are seeing out there?
Absolutely, and this is an area where I'd love to be able to do a study. Haven't been able to yet, but I think there are a lot of factors just from my own perception, and I know I'm not like the typical probably person driving around looking at other people's headlights, but there's an abnormally high number of times where I feel glared by a vehicle and I can tell those are aftermarket LEDs on a vehicle that wasn't designed for those headlights. And so those not technically, they are illegal, but it's not really enforced on the state level commonly. In different states, they have laws that when you get your state inspection, you're supposed to be failed if you have aftermarket headlights. I have no idea how often that's happening. But another common thing would be like lift kits on a pickup or work lights that people put on their vehicles and drive around with turned on. That if you go on Amazon to buy these, it will say for off-road use only. But nobody, again, that I'm aware of is really enforcing that. And so I think that is a part of what we're experiencing, but it's the part that's really hard for us to measure right now.
So let's look ahead a little bit at another headlight technology, adaptive driving beam technology. So this is an area where we have seen some slight shift in the regulation in recent years, right? Can you tell us what that technology is and the regulatory situation there?
That's right. So adaptive driving beams are kind of taking technology that is been in place with high beam assist, but also for other crash prevention systems that are using cameras, and the the system can use the camera information to track exactly where other vehicles are kind of in the field of view relative to the vehicle with the technology. And then with the right headlight technology, you can dim out the portions of the high beam that are pointed at those other vehicles. And this is all happening dynamically. So as you're driving, you can picture like the angle to the other vehicles constantly changing, but the headlight can dim out fast enough to keep up with that. And so it's really cool technology. It's been around for a long time in other countries. A lot of European vehicles have had them for quite a while, but it wasn't allowed under our regulatory kind of framework. And so there was a long rulemaking process. NHTSA did eventually kind of shift the standard to allow them. The problem from my perspective is the way it was kind of shoehorned into the existing kind of setup of looking at different angles and brightness levels instead of treating it as a brand new kind of technology. And so what that means is that it's been very hard for manufacturers to redesign their ADB that is being sold other places to fit the U.S. regulation. So there's only one or two vehicles, even now that I'm aware of, that you can buy it on. We're still trying to get one to test. So it unfortunately is not something you can go out and find readily available right now.
Yeah, and even if every new model in 2026, let's say, came standard with ADBs, it's still going to be a long time before we would see that technology out on the road. So, I mean, I think, the average vehicle age is about 12, 13 years old out there. And so there's a lot of older vehicles. It takes a long time for these improvements to filter into the fleet. Are there other things that can be done? Better street lighting, that sort of thing that can make the roads safer in the meantime.
Yeah, in terms of glare specifically, one of the things I looked at was, matching crashes with and without glare and trying to see what was different about these. And so the ones where kind of glare was more often to be a factor were usually lower speed roads, but sometimes where it's raining or wet, and so maybe the lane markings are hard to see. It's another technology thing, but a system that could kind of do a better job of keeping you in your lane, especially if it could sense that there's potential for glare because there's a lot of light, coming in, could help as well. So street lighting in lower speed environments certainly could be helpful as well because it's not going to cause the glare but give you the visibility. So yeah, there are things that can be done, but I'm not sure there's any quick fix right now.
And so, again, we've seen or heard, I should say, a lot of complaints about headlight glare in recent years. It's clearly something that people are noticing and people are thinking about. The newest study, says it's not necessarily causing a lot of crashes. But what's your message to someone that's just driving at night isn't that much fun because there's just too much headlight glare? What's your message to that person?
Well, it's a hard situation to be in. I mean, there are a lot of people that have health-related conditions that are going to be more sensitive to that. Or as we said earlier, even as you age, it's going to become more of an issue. But there are a couple things kind of in the data that suggest possible ways forward. So one of those is that drivers in newer vehicles tended to report less glare, even when they were in a crash. So it could be the case, and there are other kind of more of those laboratory studies that have suggested this, that if you have better headlights yourself, you may be less sensitive to glare from other headlights. And so it allows you to still see what you need to see, even when you're experiencing glare.
Right, like if you're driving during the daytime and someone has their brights on, it's like no big deal, right?
Right, and part of that is your eyes adapted.
Sure.
And so it's not going to always happen the same way, but it's the same concept of if you get enough light to see what you need to, then the disability part may not be as big of a problem. Another thing I would say, though, is just try to keep in mind that some of it's a matter of perspective. Your headlights might be causing glare to other drivers in certain conditions you're not aware of, and vice versa. But we're aware of the glare from the others more than necessarily, oh, I can't see far enough with my own headlights. And so part of it is just understanding might help with kind of all of our perception of this is an inherent kind of balance that is required for the technology. And remembering when you're annoyed by someone else's headlights that, well, maybe it helps them see and avoid a crash, just like my headlights are, if they're bright enough, are going to do the same for me. It might just give you that different perspective.
All right, so we've got research that you've done showing that good visibility is linked with lower crash rates. We've got this new research showing that glare isn't implicated in more crashes over the period of time. What's next for you in terms of studying headlights? Do you have any studies in mind to look at this problem further?
I think the next thing on the horizon probably would be as vehicles with adaptive driving beam technology reach our market, we need to figure out how to incorporate those in our rating system. So it may be too much the technical weeds of things, but do we treat it like we're treating high beam assist, or there are other added benefits beyond high beam assist? How do we measure those on our track? Do we have different target vehicles set up that the ADB needs to respond to? So again, we're still waiting for those vehicles to be able to test them out, but that's probably the next thing.
That is interesting, because presumably if you did a low beam test on our test track with an ADB equipped vehicle, it would just be blasting light the whole time because there's nothing for it to respond to.
Exactly. Right.
Interesting. All right. Well, we'll see. Hopefully we'll get some of those in soon.
Yeah, I hope so too.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for spending some time with us today. I've been talking with Matt Brumbelow about headlights and about this new study looking at headlight glare over time and how it's affected crash rates. You can check that out over at IIHS.org. And you can check out headlight ratings for your vehicle and the next one you're considering as well. So, Matt, thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe.